Okay, my talk tonight is going to be titled Embodying Abstraction, an Interdisciplinary Investigation of Art's Biomorphic Forms. And what I would like to offer here is a way of looking at ARP's biomorphic sculptures through the lens of what is being termed in several ways cognitive neuroscience, but also when it's, of course, deployed in humanities as neuroaesthetics. What we're trying to do here tonight is to adopt this framework for those of you who might be less familiar with the field. This is a field that exploits the knowledge from cognitive neuroscience to investigate neural underpinnings of the aesthetic experience, and particularly focusing on visual arts when it comes to interdisciplinary studies. Of course, cognitive neuroscience uses tools different from art history, like brain imaging and neurophysiological techniques. For us, what's interesting is to investigate the aesthetic experience as characterized by certain activations of areas of the brain that have bearings on emotions, reward sensations, and sense of beauty. So, first of all, let's try and give a working definition of perception. What we mean when we talk about perception is not just the sensory signals that the body registers through the sense organs, but also the cognitive processing that takes place in the brain that decodes these sensory signals to attribute them meaning and make sense of the world around us. So, in a nutshell, we can say, as a working definition, perception is the brain's interpretation of sensory signals. And today we're going to focus, as I said, on form perception, also on embodied cognition. That are our two main angles from which we're going to be looking at the work of ARP, specifically on the biometric forms. So, first of all, let's just investigate some features and characteristics of form perception, how they relate to the sculptures of the biomorphic type that we're going to be discussing tonight. So first of all, perception depends on a series of local feature detectors, especially visual perception. When we talk about this specific type of perception, what we're really describing is not an image that we absorb passively from observing reality, but it is actually the assemblage from the brain of a series of separate features that get analyzed in different areas of our brains. You have a graph here showing, for example, the basic features detectors. It means that there are some cells in the brain, some population of neurons. Each one of these population of neurons has a very specific task. So here, for example, you have different areas that process when a sensory input of the visual type comes in. Here you have a ladybird flying. You have separate areas that analyze the color. Another area, a group of neurons, will analyze the shape. Another one, the form. Another one, the movement. And then all of these properties are processed independently, but then they get put together in the brain, and the how is still, of course, under debate with neuroscientists, to give us a percept of the world that makes sense to us, that has meaning. So it's interesting to notice that this local detection doesn't need to be consistent, as in, when we look at a global scene, it needs to be locally consistent, but globally can be inconsistent. So, for example, when we look at a painting, there can be two different characters on two extremities of a painting. Each one has a shadow, perhaps going in different directions. If it's not overall consistent, we tend to not notice, but we notice local inconsistencies very well. So the brain functions in opposites. Whatever is red is not green, complementary colors, okay? Whatever is blue is not yellow. Whatever is left is not right. Whatever is up is not down. Whatever is concave is not convex. That is interesting that there is this way of functioning of our detection system that is in dichotomies, and that's a characteristic of our basic perception of these very basic features. Why does this have bearings on the sculpture that we're going to be talking about today? Because our visual system, when confronted with two images like this, reads some raw data that comes in, which is partially very different. As you can see, these are two versions of evocation of a form, human, lunar, and spectral from 1950. And as you can see, if you squint your eyes and just detect the highlights and the dark areas of these two sculptures, you will see that these two images are very, very different, aside from the general outline on the outside of the figure. Yet, our visual system is able to decode enough to understand that these are the same sculpture, despite the level of shiny, the contours, the linear appearances. It will look different as a raw data, but our brain is able to decode that these are the same sculpture in two different materials. Here, one thing to notice in this kind of object, and it's also characteristic of ARP's biomorphic sculptures, is that our visual system, there's research demonstrated that it shows preferential processes for curved over angular shapes. The idea of curved is associated across sensory domain from visual to tactile with the idea of softness and organic. And we have research that demonstrates that curved objects activate the reward brain region, the same that activates when we look at a beautiful painting, or when we eat a good food or listen to a music we like. So this reward-related brain region is activated a lot stronger with curved shapes rather than sharp angled objects. So we have a bias towards organic forms, which also makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. Then there are more complex features detectors. Those are the ones that make us really quick in putting together a set of features that are identifiable as, for example, faces and bodies or animals. So we are very quick on detecting a face. If you think about the original emojis, when it was just like dot, dot, and parentheses, meaning a smiley face, that was the bare perceptual minimum for us to identify a face. Two dots and a half parenthesis. So we are very quick, we are wired to need a bare minimum of information to be able to see faces and bodies and animals. Also, we're very quick in detecting biological motion, which is the way that live organisms move. And then we are also wired to detect quickly some special patterns such as spirals, circles, radial patterns, and so on. And there's a wide bibliography on these abilities for us to assemble basic features into more complex early detection objects that I've listed here. So if we take a sculpture like Growth from 1938, which here we have in marble, we can see that this sculpture is actually very interesting properties that are explainable with the complex feature detector system. So for example, first of all, this kind of sculpture supports the phenomenon of pareidolia. Pareidolia is when, for example, you look at a cloud and you see a face in it. As I said, our brain is quick to detect faces, so a very minimum of formal similarity will trigger the face recognition system. So same with bodies. we look at this in the lower part, for example, it looks like the bottom of the back of a person with the beginning of the split into two legs, and so on with the rest of this form. So ARP's work of this kind of sculpture supports the phenomenon of pareidolia, demonstrating our ability of grouping the formal feature of this sculpture into a percept that evokes a physical shape of a body, for example, or of an organism. Also, this kind of work has some pattern recognition from our visual system. For example, this kind of work is structured in a way to suggest fractal properties. So, of course, this is not a literal branching pattern, okay? But there is an emanation of forms from a central point that echoes fractal branching patterns, for example, and a sort of radial symmetry, sort of radial organization of the masses of this sculpture that mirrors growth patterns in plants and in organisms. So again, something that is infused in this shape with full exploitation of our perceptual abilities. This is a kind of art that talks to our perceptual system in very direct and immediate terms. Now, of course, perception also uses context to yield meaningful objects and events, as in context is helpful for us in decoding and disambiguating the visual signal that comes in. So I brought, as an example, I wanted to discuss briefly this idea of the titles that art uses for a lot of his works of this type as providing a semantic context. For example, a lot of sculptures of the biomorphic type are called in the 1930s concretion. And I brought this quote that for me is very interesting from the exhibition catalog at MoMA 1958, curated by James Strauss-Sobey. And the quote is, "Concretion signifies the natural processes of condensation, hardening, coagulation, thickening, growing together. Concretion designates the solidification of a mass. Concretion designates curdling, the curdling of the earth and the heavenly bodies. Concretion designates solidification, the mass of the stone, the plant, the animal, the man. Concretion is something that has grown. I want my work to find its humble place in the woods, the mountains, in nature." So this quote is important because it guides the interpretation of the visual features we have here into feeling that this form is dynamically changing and forming throughout all those verbs that are listed at the beginning of this quote. And so when we think about semantic context, we have to think about a network of meaningful relationships and associations between the word's meaning and the visual structure that we're analyzing through our senses. And so that's what's guiding our interpretation of this information. Of course, semantic context and its interference and its implications for the shape, it's a dynamic construct that happens as we meet the sculpture. There's many examples when art does this, even very early in the 1920s. Here you have, for example, a birdman to the left, and you have mountain, navel, anchors, and table to the right. As you can see, with that minimal perceptual signal that is provided, as you can see, art is very elegant, economic, essential, and yet through these words, we can fully grasp the meaning behind the formal means that are used in these biomorphic shapes. When it comes to the biomorphic sculptures, actually these are just evoking biomorphic shapes, are not fully developed like later, but for example, the heads of the bird here are very visible, and so is a face-like structure that, as I said, we're very quick to notice. So in the biomorphic sculpture, like these ones, torso with buds to the left, or dream flower with lips to the right, the style that ARP is using here is not just recognizable by recurring formal features that characterize these works, but rather by the fact that these features are really bearing the trace of a sort of instability, metamorphosis, and thus they kind of appear to include the principles that led to their creation, as if they're created by a push from within. In this regard, there is a text written in either 1918 or 19 by Alexander Parthens, which is, of course, a collective pseudonym of Arp, Zara, and Walter Cerner. And there's a passage that is illuminating when it comes to talk about what Arp intended to represent through this art. For Arp, it was no longer a question of improving and specifying an aesthetic system and making it more precise. He wanted a direct form of production, one that exactly conformed to the way a stone breaks off from a mountain, a flower blossoms, or an animal perpetuates itself. He wanted imaginative qualities that are not to be found in any museum, a type of animal-like formation with all its wild intensity and diversities. So this quote is important in the context of this discussion. Of course, photography supports also the visual reading of some of our sculpture in their becoming, in their transformation. So here, for example, you have the Human Concretion of 1935 that's photographed lying in a garden of clover in three distinct orientations. The two on the left are actually the same from two different photographic angles. And this is actually coming from an essay published by Brandon Taylor in Hans Harp in the United States. And in this essay, he is noticing how surprising it is to see this sculpture placed in nature in these photographs from all these different angles, and notices how innovative this placement is by stating it is no exaggeration to say that a sculpture not having a single principle as well as stable mode of placement with respect to its supports was and remains without precedent in modernist conceptions of objecthood and aesthetic theory, and remains virtually unique in the much larger Western tradition of three-dimensional work. So this idea of almost making you feel this becoming, also through the aid of photography, making you almost see in a cinematic way distortion of the object. I'm going to have to just mention but not discuss, of course, the idea of also Arp's exhibitions as context to attribute certain formal, visual, and conceptual qualities to the sculpture. This would be for another paper, but I wanted to mention the exhibition as context. So, of course, when it comes to form perception, we also have to think about the fact that visual features can activate through vision neurons that belong to other sensory domains. Examples are very easy in the case of Arp's biomorphic sculpture. You can see versions made in different materials, such as navel and tooth thoughts, here from 1932, that you can see in the bronze version and in the gesso version. If you notice a difference in these two objects beyond the material, of course, this is due also to the fact that it is a sculpture in three pieces that can be placed in an infinite number of ways. What you notice here is that just by looking, you can tell that the picture on the left is going to be of an object which is hard to the touch and cold and shiny and heavy if you pick it up. All of these are tactile qualities, while the object to the right is going to be slightly rough and warmer, and the part that is colored is going to be smoother with comparison to the navel part of the sculpture. So again, tactile qualities conveyed through sight. This is something also that biomorphic sculpture is explaining, is exploiting from our visual abilities. Now, I wanted to move on to the idea of embodied cognition. Embodied cognition can be explained if we think about his research question: how does our being in the body affect art perception and creation? And specifically, what role does this play in ARP's sculpture? Of course, for bibliography, the reference text that began opening this field of inquiry can be traced back to Maurice Merleau-Ponty in the 60s, from whom I brought two main quotes for the sake of time. The body is our general medium for having a world summarizes the inquiry angle from embodied cognition point of view. So from this idea that we perceive the world in a certain way because we are in a body with certain characteristics, tonight I wanted to briefly discuss the role of touch and the idea of sensory motor interaction. So when we are in an environment, with respect to objects, we code objects in our mind differently based on the distance from us. Of course, touching objects, touching in general is a cognitive need. When we have an object in a reaching space, so-called peripersonal space, it encodes in the brains differently, it's processed differently than when an object is far away from us at a distance where we cannot touch it. We can see this better in a frontal view. The personal space is basically extending to the reach of our arm when stretched. The role of touch in art sculpture is extensive. There is a photographic documentation of Arp fondling his sculpture very frequently. Here you can see him showing a plaster sculpture to studio visitors, including Max Ernst in Meudon in 29. And of course, this assesses the formal quality like weight and allows fondling to better feel the characteristics of the sculpture. After all, when he resumed working on plaster, he also switched to, rather than commissioning woodworkers to make his sculpture, he switched to, again, modeling personally and often started from blocks of plaster to then file them down to the desired shape. Photographic portraits of Arp are also to be found with him fondling the contours, and if you can see, he's making contact just with the tip of his fingers, which is the typical way of touching when you have to understand the outline and outside surface of an object. To the top right, another photo of Arp in the studio, fondling one of his works with the tip of the fingers. We have a very interesting quote that actually helps us to make sense of how these sculptures are actually born. I pursue this material without knowing where I'm going, talking about the plaster. Here it is. That is the mystery. My hands speak for themselves. A dialogue takes place between them and the plaster as if I were absent, as if I were necessary. Here, form are born, friendly or strange, which arrange themselves without me. I observe them as one sometimes observes human figures on a cloud. There's a little typo here, as if I were not necessary. Sorry, pardon me for that. So here you can see that Arp is talking about sometimes this come together almost as human figures on a cloud. Again, the phenomenon of pareidolia, of us visualizing shapes within shapes because our visual system is set up in a certain way. Another very famous quote, which I probably don't even need to read to you at this point, is again talking about how sculptures comes into physical being. You can see Arp working on the right. Of course, as he's filing the plaster personally, he gets touch feedback from the matter itself, which determines the shape, the final shape that Arp is producing. Again, in the biomorphic sculptures, they are shaped a certain way for touch, not for vision only. A very important fact. And here he's describing how he's intensifying certain traits and eliminating certain others. And it's a very long process of grinding and working that sometimes takes years to complete. Of course, if you add to being close to a sculpture, seeing someone manipulating it, or even manipulating it just to photograph it, as you can see here, this idea of mirror neurons, of us imagining ourselves as if we were doing it, to rotate this sculpture. Again, you can see how this idea of transformation, motion, growth that he wanted to impart in the works is really grounded in our perceptual system. The last observation that I wanted to discuss with you was, again, on the role of touch, this idea of sensory motor representation and affordances. This is basically discussing the findings that for us, when we have an object represented internally, in this representation, we encode knowledge from how sensory input needs to change when we come in contact with the object as a consequence of a motor action. Okay, so you can see the hands assuming different shapes in this slide to perform different actions. It's the classic case of when you extend your arm to grab your coffee cup and you already shape your hand in the shape of a cup to grab it. That is the classic sensory motor relationship you have with objects. Of course, there are tests that prove this. You're faster to grab the left cup with your left hand and the right cup with your right hand in this slide. In cognitive science, moving on to one more concept connected to our motion relation with object, we need to also bring on the table this concept of affordance. So affordance is when you look at an object and its shape and its characteristics suggest you a possibility for an action. So we have hands at the end of our arms that grab in a certain way. The handles you see on the right-hand side from the La Pedrera house in Barcelona are shaped to match the hand grasp and the hand twist precisely to wrap around your finger. So when it comes to the biomorphic sculpture, we can see, for example, even the precursor of those have affordances. If you look at these specific sculpture, plan sur levé, or raised a plane called forest tables, you can see that the idea of these two trees that are like a table suggests that the third shape is pushed to the ground, but it can actually be raised or pulled up by grabbing its head. Likewise, art will reach the pinnacle of this idea of affordance when it starts producing sculptures that are in several parts to be moved around by the visitor, as for example, very famously, three annoying objects on a face, 1930, you can see the gesso version here. So inviting, sculpting through the touch, for the touch, and for vision, exploiting all of the characteristics that I've described from our visual system and our sensory motor interaction with the world and our being in the body, he produces a series of objects that are really never ending, perceptually forever new, and engaging and calling our attention for an infinite number of variations. You can just see how even curators have fun playing with repetitions within variations of the infinite combination that such sculptures allow. So I'm seeing that I've run out of time, so I'll come to my conclusions. And this is what this paper hopefully has shown, that Arp's integration of chance operation and organic materiality in his sculptures, perhaps intuitively deployed, strategies which reflect our current understanding of how the brain processes aesthetic information. So this paper argued that beyond its historical importance, the enduring appeal of Arp's shapes is due to the universal neural substrate for aesthetic experience that transcends time and artistic movements. Thank you.